But I want us to focus on that last line for a moment. Joseph weeps. Joseph gushes tears. It's the first time in 14 chapters that we see this quality in Joseph. And it leads me to a very important point today. And that is that tears are actually one of our best helmets of protection. Sometimes we think of crying and having a moment is one of those examples of weakness, but actually what we are seeing today is that tears are a helmet of protection. Not too long ago, I was in a store in Burlingame, and I ran into an older woman who I knew doesn't go to this church, but seemed to be having maybe a bit of a bad day. And I just said to her, "How are you?" And she said, "Well, I'm not really doing that well." And then I said, "Well, I notice you're buying flowers for someone. Who are you buying flowers for?" And she paused for a long moment, and then she looked at me and she said, I'm buying them for myself because my life is so hard right now. And I realize that if I don't buy these flowers for myself, then no one will. And at that moment, I just began to cry. I mean, not just like a little cry. I began to gush right there in the middle of the store. And I want you to know it felt so good. That I had been having such a hard week, that I'd been stressed out like most of us, a little bit of angry about some things, but that I realized at that moment that tears are one of the best helmets of protection. And so my friends, have a cry a day throughout this next season. But then Joseph, he wipes his eyes and he turns towards his brothers and he says these words, "Don't be afraid." By the way, these are the words of God. Whenever you hear the words, "Do not be afraid, for I am your God," remember the No Fear, God Near series? That is God speaking. Don't be afraid. And here is the focus for the morning. Am I in the place of God? Asks Joseph. This line is one you should memorize because it is a line of resiliency. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done in the saving of many lives. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, for the saving of many lives. Now, if Joseph had a mantra for his life, it would be this. For everything that happened to him in his long and hard life, and the Bible would tell us that he lives 110 years, at every juncture, he is able to say, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. Which leads us to our most important point of the morning, that the world sometimes does bring us into harm. There are harms in our lives. We are facing them now. But God always turns it into good. Again, this entire book is a story of harm being brought into people's lives, but God turning it into something good. Whether it's Adam and Eve who bring sin into the world through the snake, God intends it for good. Whether it's the corruption of a dangerous world, but then God helps Noah through. Whether it's Pharaoh who enslaved the Israelites, but then God brought them into promise. Whether it was Jesus who went to the cross, but God used it to bring about salvation. You intended to harm me, but God used it for good. Sometimes the world brings us into harm, but God always turns it into something good. Now, why don't we believe that? Let's be honest. Most of us feel that kind of sentence, especially coming from a preacher like me, it just sounds a little glib. It sounds a little easy. Frankly, it sounds a little televangelisty. Let me just give you an example. This is the 3-year anniversary of my ministry with you. And I don't expect you to remember this, but I began my ministry here 3 years ago, the beginning of December. And my first message was about a man named Zacchaeus, and I talked about reaching people outside in the world And the lead illustration I had for that sermon was Joel Osteen. Here are some of his own words, and I'm going to try really hard here not to do a bad impersonation of Joel Osteen. Don't worry about your future and how you're going to accomplish a dream. God has already lined up what you need. All of us can look back and see the things that should have defeated us. You're still standing, and that's the goodness of God. You've been armed with strength for every battle. The forces that are for you are greater than the forces that are against you. Too often we get frustrated by difficulties, but you have to realize that you can't have a harvest without a few weeds. Oh, get me a loud tie right now. I'm feeling it. But it is encouraging, isn't it? And it is the same words that we are hearing from Joseph's theology. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. And I believe that if we can begin to live this in our lives deep down, that we can become more resilient. So let's try it right now. Our church and schools and restaurants and hair facilities are closed, but God is going to use it for good. We are feeling lonely and isolated right now, but God's going to do something good with it and bring us out of it. Our government in Washington is broken, but God's going to bring about good through it. There is racial injustice in this world, but God is going to bring about change. There's a raging pandemic occurring, but God is going to someday use it for good. Feel any better? No, me neither. Which leads me to my last point. Resiliency takes practice.